Just to introduce myself, my name is Gracie Hirota, and I'm the Community Programming Associate here with Yellow Heart. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us here today and making time to come to this very special Leaders Link Up event, Reimagining Capitalism in America. For those of you who've never attended one before, the purpose of a Leaders Link Up event is to bring together community members, policy crafters, and change makers who have the heart to further meaningful and substantive progress in the battle to support survivors of trauma. The innate relationship between mental health and social conditions are continually overlooked, with societal causes commonly disregarded, shifting the focus primarily on the individual. Mental health diagnoses frequently begin and end with the individual, identifying biological and medical causes at the expense of actually examining the social factors. However, the social, political, and economic organization of society must be recognized as a significant contribution to people's mental health, with certain societal structures being more advantageous to certain populations' mental health and well-being than to others. So today we're here to take a deeper look into the way that our society functions as a means of the economy rather than the economy serving the people. Doing so, we'll first highlight the effect that capitalism has on society, then examine how it relates to mental health, and as a close, we'll discuss the ways in which we can continue as a society and reimagine capitalism in a trauma-informed way.
Thank you, Gracie, so much for setting the context for tonight's discussion. My name is Naja Brown. I'm the VP of Program Strategy here at Yellow Heart, and I'm the moderator for this discussion. I just wanted to give an introduction and a quick thank you to our lovely panelists who have been so kind to attend tonight. First, I'd like to introduce Sylvester Annie. He is a member of the Sunrise Movement, LA, and a congressional candidate for the 38th District of California. And then we also have Eric Morrison-Smith, who is a policy associate for PolicyLink and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time out of your day to come out and support this special event. Also, if each of you would like to give a brief introduction on who you are, Sylvester and then Eric, and then we can get started.
Well, thank you for the invite. Like I just said, my name is Sylvester Annie Jr., member of Sunrise Movement LA. I'm also a congressional candidate in the 38th District of California. And I mean, the reason why I got into this movement is the same reason why everybody else got into this movement, is because we can't afford to not do something. We can't afford to, let time go by as more and more people fall into poverty, more and more people can't afford to go to school, more and more people can't afford their health care. And all this is under the guise of a system that is meant to economically disenfranchise people. And, a lot of people are now, really waking up to what's going on. And, it's the perfect time to just, coalition build and come together, come up with ideas for how we can really reimagine what society looks like. So that's why I'm here. And again, I'm happy to be here with you all.
Yeah, and I'll just second that. Thank you so much for having me. Talking about capitalism is something that I love to do, so I'm excited to be here. But to introduce myself, Eric Morrison-Smith, my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a policy associate with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and PolicyLink. And just like a real quick overview of which each of those organizations are. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute that's really about advancing economic justice and racial justice. And then the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color is a network of 200 organizations nationally, but mostly in California, who are all about transforming policies and systems that are impacting boys and men of color, their families and community. So at the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, I managed our California state policy work.
Great. Thank you both for introducing yourselves and giving a little bit of context as to why you decided to be a panelist today. And so my first question is, what was the moment that you realized the impacts of capitalism is not only on your life, but on others around you?
Oh, directed to me first?
Yeah, go right ahead.
The first time that I realized that, I mean, so many times. I mean, really, when you just look at the course of your life, um, I mean, you see it every day. When you're living in the richest country in the world, and you have people who are unhoused and don't have enough to shelter themselves or enough food to eat. I think really the moment for me that really started to connect all of the dots was more recently. I think over the course of my life, the way that capitalism is structured out is that you become disillusioned. Like things are normal that aren't normal, or and you just get used to the way that you live in life. And I think I started really connecting the dots. I went to Azusa Pacific for uh, psychology, and then I was pursuing a marriage family therapy degree, and I was doing a lot of mutual aid with the unhoused community, and it wasn't changing their situation, right? So it's work that needs to be done, but also doesn't change the situation. So then it's just like, okay, you know what can we do, to prevent, right? We always talking about getting to prevention standpoint. And then, for me, it was education, right? So if you get to people before they get to that point, maybe it can change the course of their life. Um, and then from that point, then when you get into the education system and you look at, I was doing a lot of work in South Central, you look at the neighborhoods these kids are going to have to go back to. It's almost like it's a perpetual cycle where you can, in a lot of sense, only go but so far if these kids don't have the resources and they have to go back to these communities that are under resourced. And then just, I mean, then when you connect the police violence and how so much is invested in those institutions rather than in programs of social uplift, it really started to connect the dots between, me and my, psychology therapy background, education, economic deprivation, and yeah, I mean, just the system that we're living in today. So I think more recently I've been able to put together the dots, but it's something that we just see our entire lives, but we have to get out of that disillusionment.
Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, for me, for the last couple of years, when people just ask me about like my story and my journey about the advocacy work that I do now, I've always told people that like I had my transformation when I was in college, through everything that was happening with the police brutality, people kneeling on the football field, and so on. But just recently, I was looking through some old files from when I was in high school, and I found an essay that I wrote called "The American Nightmare." And I was like really shocked. I'm like, what was I talking about in high school? And then when I reread it, I was basically talking about how like I was taught all these narratives about like, financial freedom and the American dream. If you work hard, you're going to reap what you sow. But in this essay, I was like pointing out the contradictions and like what I was actually observing through the lives of my loved ones. So I'd say that like in the past, I would have said at around the time I was like 23 is when I started to really realize it. But when I reflected, I actually observing this my entire life. And I would say that like most of what was in that essay and what I observed when I was younger was actually through like my mother, who for as long as I can remember has worked 2 to 3 jobs. The only year she didn't work 2 to 3 jobs was 1993, which is like the year that I was born, which is also the year that my father was incarcerated. So she needed time to grieve. So she wasn't working during that time and was able to rely on family. But some of the things that like I really learned through my mom's experience is that like because of how much she had to labor and work those three jobs just to like provide, like she didn't really get to prioritize herself mentally, physically, emotionally, or even aspirationally, because when you're working 2 to 3 jobs just trying to provide, you can't even really think about the future. You're really in the here and now. So I think it was really through her experience that I started to learn about the economy that we all operate under. And I really started to realize that like, she is giving everything to some of these businesses and industries that don't really give a damn about her and will replace her in a second to find the next person who's going to be willing to sacrifice themselves so that some corporation can make as much profit as possible. So I think it was really through her experiences and, the common threads that I saw with other family members that I actually started to recognize what this system is.
Oh yeah, thank you. And kind of the story about your mother really brings up my next point, in that some argue for capitalism and they say it aids in the creation of jobs, that it stimulates the economy and improves the quality of life for the average American household. However, others argue that capitalism doesn't benefit everyone, and especially with capitalism's dependency on social hierarchies, coupled with its unpredictable cycles of growth and retraction, that it raises anxiety and sometimes to the level of traumatic stress. Do you think that capitalism today is more of a net positive or negative as far as its impact on society?
I mean, to that question, I say just look outside. When you're looking at the climate disaster that we're going through, the disparities in healthcare, education, our criminal injustice system, when you really look at every single sector of society, it's been shaped by this system. And what COVID-19 did was it highlighted the underlying conditions that have been, ravaging communities for many, many years, but haven't been addressed. And just like how COVID, again, it'll put you in the hospital if you have those underlying conditions. I think that we saw a microcosm of what's been going on for decades, all inflamed within 1 year. So, when you talk about whether it's a net positive or net negative, it's net positive for some, the elite, the 1%, who are amassing all of this wealth and exploiting, the rest of the population. It's good for them, but in terms of, for the mass of people, it's a negative.
Yeah, I think Sylvester hit on it perfectly. I think that one of the things that I wanted to highlight in thinking about that question is that it really depends on what we are measuring as success and who we're talking about. I think that we often measure capitalism just based off of GDP and how much we're producing, but we don't view it from all the ways that Sylvester just mentioned, because capitalism really has a cultural impact, it has an impact on the environment. It even has an impact on the church and the way that we date. The logics that are rooted in capitalism are kind of saturated everywhere throughout society. And then the one thing that was also just coming top of mind for this question is I think that when we think about capitalism just domestically, I could sometimes see why people would think that it's positive. But I think it's also important to recognize that capitalism is an international system that not only exploits people locally, but also does internationally, And sometimes when I have this conversation about the benefits of capitalism, people will talk about oh, but look at your life. It's so comfortable and convenient. But I recognize that the convenience that I experience is often off of the backs of exploited Black and brown people in other countries. So when I think about the environmental issues that Sylvester just mentioned, when I think about the cultural impact, and when I think about the impact worldwide, I definitely think that there is a negative net impact. And that's not even getting into the ways that capitalism impacts policing, the ways capitalism impacts wars, and all of that type of death and destruction.
Yeah, thank you both for your perspective. And I think we've gotten to the conclusion that it does have a negative net impact. And kind of diving deep into that and kind of shifting the conversation more specifically on capitalism's effect on mental health. So according to PACES, countries with the highest level of economic inequality have the greatest number of people with stress-related diseases. What are your thoughts on the effects of economic disparities that are created by capitalism, leading to social hierarchies and their relationships to stress?
I want to let Eric go first so we can switch. I know sometimes it's hard following up, so let me go ahead and let you kick us off.
Yeah, especially hard following up after you, man. but yeah, I think that there's a lot here. So the more time that we spend here, the better. But I think that one thing that comes to mind in terms of like the inequalities is like we're seeing a lot of talk right now about we should tax the wealthy, which I agree with. But one question that I often like think about too that I want to spend some time on is like, how does it get to the point where the wealthy have accumulated and concentrated so much wealth, right? And it's connected to this wealth inequality that we're seeing. And so much of that is because we aren't reaping the benefits of our labor. One thing that's the case in economic theory is like as productivity increases, our wages are supposed to increase as well. And for the past 50 years, productivity has basically like shot through the roof, but our wages have stayed stagnant. And what's basically happened is all that wealth that we have produced has gone to the wealthiest in the country. And we're left with like crumbs. So when I think about like, economic inequality, I think that that's a conversation that just needs to be brought up. And then the condition that leaves so many of us in is one of instability, and it also makes it so that like we are concentrated in low wage jobs, which are very stressful jobs. They don't have health care. They don't have knowledge about like when their schedule is going to be until the day before. And if you don't know what your schedule is going to be like, for your schedule for the week is going to be until the day before, you can't plan for leisure. You can't really plan for self-care, which is both of those things are deeply connected to, mental health and well-being. And you also can't, take the vacations that are needed because the wages are so low. So I think that like this mass disparity in wealth has those type of like material impacts on us that don't allow us to really take care of ourselves and live comfortably. And then the one thing that I'll say, and I'll pass this to Alistair, is that Sylvester, excuse me, sorry about that, is that even though the economic disparities exist, like these narratives that I kind of alluded to earlier that we know aren't true, like also exist. So like, we're told that if we work hard, we're gonna make the money that we deserve, right? And that if we produce that, like eventually we'll reap those benefits. But we continue to like push, try to be as productive as possible, and then burn ourselves out and never actually reap the benefits that we deserve. So I think that that's also like the two things that really need to challenge is like how are resources distributed, and then we really need to challenge these narratives about our economy that really motivate how we interact with it.
That's why it's tough following up because when everyone, I mean, we're in this room and then we're all really in agreement with a lot of these positions, then a lot of things already get said. But when it comes to the mental health aspect of it, capitalism has a net negative effect on our mental health, and I'll take it back to the reason or how capitalism intersects with all these different issues like within our society. So I think we have to have the understanding that racism in this country is an excuse used, for capitalism, right? So the capitalism that that gave birth to slavery. Slavery was the first form of capitalism within this country. That and the amount of inhumanity that you had to do unto other people, humans can't continue to do harm onto others without justifying it in some way. So I can't just be just evil to a human being. I have to tell myself that they're not a human being, and I have to back that up scientifically, theoretically, morally, I mean, you'll find any reason to justify what it is that you're doing to this person. And that's what you saw happen with the slaves that were in America, the indigenous folk that were on this land already, is that when you're not looking at them as human beings, then you can do anything with them. And that's what America did. They did anything with them. And all in the name of capitalism, all in the name of acquiring and amassing a vast amount of resources with very little output, because they weren't paying people to do this work to build up this country. They were forcing them to do this forced labor against their own will. And through that, it justified creating a sense of nobodiness, like within those communities that they were exploiting, to break them down. And that's what capitalism does. It breaks us down. It leaves us in a constant state of never feeling satisfied because we never have enough. And I think that's what we're also seeing in society right now, in American society, is that we're in a place of late stage capitalism, because what capitalism does is that it'll keep on taking and taking and taking until it eats itself whole. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that it's untenable to have that much inequality and instability. Every nation, every great nation that's risen to be number one in the world has faced this crisis at some point in time. And we've seen time and time again, with Roman Empire, with Genghis Khan, with all these different empires, Greeks, they end up falling because of their pride. So that's the place America's in right now, is whether or not it wants to steer itself and get out of its own way, or because of its pride and its ego, it's willing to eat itself alive.
Yeah, that's definitely a really powerful statement, and kind of looking at the overall effects of it. And something that you said to really kind of bring some cognitive dissonance to myself, and that as Black Americans, we're often seen as like less than, but we also are subjected to the phrase "all Americans are able." You have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And that's definitely a value that's ingrained within capitalism, and it renders all Americans equivalent regardless of the inherent disparities across race, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic level. That makes it potentially exceedingly difficult to succeed if you belong to a marginalized group. So, kind of on both sides of that coin, being told one thing and then also the actions of the country and the system being something different. How do you think the processes of capitalism may have specifically contributed to the trauma of these marginalized groups, such as BIPOC, women, and queer people?
Eric?
Yeah, sure. Just building off that point that you mentioned, social hierarchies, hierarchies are basically pyramids. And that means somebody has to be at the bottom. And in this society, it's been decided that those groups that you mentioned are going to be at the bottom. And some of the impacts of that with our economic structure means that when there's an economic crisis, those are the people who are going to be disproportionately impacted by it. I remember reading a statistic from OPEC that basically said in the 2007 financial crisis, it was 66% of Black people had to foreclose on homes, 53% of Latino people had to foreclose on their homes, and it was something like 16% of white people. And the reason why that happened is because the structures that are a part of this economic system have decided that we're going to be at the bottom of this hierarchy, and we're going to be the ones that are mostly impacted by it. So I think that, and I shouldn't even have to get into the reasons that poverty and losing your job and your home is a traumatic experience to these marginalized groups, So I think that is one very clear way that it has led to trauma. And then I'm just gonna say this point again, is that one of the things that we tell Black folks is that, we need to work twice as hard to make it, and in a racist society, that's just not true. And I think it's a really traumatizing experience to think that work twice as hard, see that you're working harder than everybody around you, but still not, achieve the things that you're desiring to achieve. And I've had my own personal experiences with that, where I'm like, I'm putting in more work than this person. I'm reading more, but I'm not getting the promotion, you know? And then what I start to do is I start to doubt myself. Like maybe there's something wrong with me, which is exactly what a racist society would want a Black or brown person to be thinking. You know, there's something wrong with you, and that's why you're not getting the promotion. So I think that capitalism has, you know, it has multiple ways of traumatizing us. It could, you know, lay us off. It could take our home, you know, and then it can make us doubt ourselves. So I think those are just a couple of things that I can speak to.
Nick, can you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. So the question was, how do you think the processes of capitalism may have specifically contributed to the trauma of marginalized groups?
Oh, specifically, I think that what capitalism does is that it puts us in a scarcity mindset in terms of the resources that are available to us. And, you know, natural human instinct is, you know, if there's a scarcity of resource, I need to go get mine, right? So if I need to go get mine, then my mindset is that someone's not going to have, or if I don't get it, then they can't get it, you know? So, so because of that, it's easy, or the one way to, you know, get people to act on that is if you can divide people up. You can scapegoat individuals. And that's what capitalism does, is that, and that's really what, you know, racism is that, I mean, it's an excuse for classism as well, because at the root cause of it, it's classes. Majority BIPOC communities are in that underclass, you know, because of the economic and the social, you know, disenfranchisement of the ruling capitalist class. But then it's that tool used to divide us that has us fighting for crumbs while they have the whole cake. And I think that's how it plays. That's how it plays out. Is that we have this scarcity mindset when we're really in a world of abundance. Everybody can have the bare minimum that they need to survive, to have a fulfilled life. You know, poverty is a policy choice. You know, and that's something that really resonated with me, especially when, you know, the Biden administration was talking about how the child tax credit was going to lower child poverty by 50%. Well, if we just have a lever with how high or how low we can go with child poverty, why are we stopping at 50%? Why are we going for 100%? But the capitalist mind doesn't want you to know that we can go 100%. It wants you to be happy with the crumb at 50 and, you know, hey, we're doing something when we can do so much more and we have to do so much more.
Is that right? If I love the point that you just made. And, you know, given that y'all are a violence prevention organization that's focused on healing, I felt like it was also just important to mention how, like, you know, scarcity and like poverty, and Rosa Parks said this, excuse me, not Rosa Parks, Coretta Scott King. She said that poverty is violence, you know, and what we know about people who perpetrate harm and violence is that they're often in poverty and, you know, fighting over crumbs, like you mentioned. So just in thinking about like this cycle of poverty and this cycle of violence, like they're actually like very deeply connected. So we're talking about like trauma, you know, it's very deeply connected to, you know, the violence that is only happening because people are in a state of poverty. So I just wanted to add on to that because I think it's a great point. And, you know, given that you're a violence prevention organization, it's critical to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the other thing here at Yellow Heart Committee, we believe that the revolution must be trauma informed. And so with that, I'm really interested to discuss about how we kind of reimagine things looking. And with that, I'm curious if how do you think that shifting priorities from an economy that prioritizes productivity and GDP-based productivity to an economy that prioritizes mental health, how do you think that would look?
Peaceful. That's how we're looking at it. And I think that you see people taking that power into their hand with the strikes that people are organizing. I think COVID gave an opportunity where the world paused in a way that it hasn't, and that people aren't used to. So it gave people the opportunity to think for once, because that's the other thing that capitalism does. It runs you to the ground so that you don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to think about, more than just for many, for more than just keeping the lights on, putting food on the table, or so caught up in entertainment that you don't have, enough time to really look at the structure of society. But when everything paused, it woke something up in people, and people in every sector of society started questioning whether or not they wanted to do the work that they were doing. They questioned how much they were valued at their places of employment. They started really asking themselves, like, am I happy? Do I want to do this? Do I have a choice in this? And I think that, once Pandora's box opened in that sense, it unlocks what we're starting to see now, which is the pushback against this structure of society, and people are demanding a restructuring of the values of a society. And I'm excited to see it keep on growing. I'm looking forward to see how far it goes. But it's a society where people have the autonomy to choose the type of life they want to live for themselves, and not what the ruling class tells you have to have for yourself.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think one of the things that the ruling class and a lot of like businesses have tried to tell us right now is that, like, we just need a better work-life balance. We just need more of a like community feel in the workplace, and all those things are like fine and dandy, but I would much rather corporations and businesses just pay people a living wage so that they have the resources to decide how they want to center their mental health. I would rather these places give people worker power so they could decide how the workplace looks, and how they're interacting with one another, rather than this like top-down structure that currently exists. So I think that like those are a couple of things that I could automatically already see, improving people's, wellness. And then, I just think that there would be more shared prosperity, an inclusive economy that doesn't require people to be on the sidelines, right? There are people who think that capitalism requires there to be a amount of people who aren't working, so that when they do get a job, they just are so thankful that they got a job finally, right? And they're not going to fight for anything more. Like every single person in this country should have a job if they want a job. And what that does, like, I'll give a quick example. Right now, PolicyLink is fighting for a jobs guarantee. And basically, this will make it so that the federal government will provide everybody a livable wage of $15 an hour, full benefits, and just like a real good quality job, so that if they need one, they could find one in the federal government. And what that does is that raises the floor for every other job in America, because, if this restaurant that pays $7.50 ain't gonna pay me more, I can now go, get a job at with the federal government. And that restaurant ain't gonna have no workers. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna increase pay. We're actually seeing that all across the country right now. I don't watch CNN much, but I was watching it the other day. And, there was this construction owner on there, and he was basically saying that they've had to increase their entry-level pay by 40% so that they can get some workers. And like people are like, oh, like, great job increasing the pay. And what that told me is that this entire time they had 40% more to offer, but weren't paying. And we already know that 40% was just going to the top 1%, right? So I think that, like, in thinking about an economy that prioritizes mental health and just prioritizes people is, an economy where everybody can get a job, where everybody is taken care of so they don't have to stress about whether they have health care or not. Yeah, and where they have a livable wage so that, you know, they don't got to work 2 to 3 jobs to go on vacation, or even, you know, pay for mental health services.
Yeah, thank you. And you kind of answered my next question, but I still want to ask it again just to see if it sparks any new ideas. But I'm curious as to what policy or social changes or values, even amongst American citizens, or just people who reside in this country, do you think that needs to be implemented to make sure that the move away from capitalism is trauma informed, in the sense that mental health is accounted for not only in the average American work week, but also just in the average American life?
I think to that, and it's something that was just recently introduced on the state level in California. It's something that was introduced on the federal level in California. But I think for America to move past, like I said earlier, slavery is the first, you know, concept, you know, practice of capitalism in America. For America to move past the legacy of slavery, America has to first end slavery. And when we look at, you know, within our prison system and the 13th Amendment, slavery was never completely abolished. An exception to continue to exploit people, because America has never been able to be a sustainable nation without the exploitation of other people. So I feel like when you atone for one of the original sins of America within the 13th Amendment and completely abolishing slavery, I think that you're going to see a domino effect on every single sector of society, because now you're going to eliminate the incentive to criminalize communities. And when you eliminate that incentive to criminalize communities, that's going to tackle the policing issues and how so much funding goes towards policing. If you make it too expensive to, if you make it too expensive for a slave catcher to slave catch, then that's how you end slave catching. And then you have to put those resources back into the community, back into healthcare, back into education, and I think that's to me that's a great start in terms of getting to the root causes of what, you know, created the systemic inequalities that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think that's all great suggestions. You know, I'll get like real practical with some things that could happen quickly, and then I'm gonna get theoretical for a bit, just because I love history and I haven't brought any history into the conversation yet. So Sylvester already did that. But like real practically, I think that, you know, right now our economy and like the logics that are at the root of it are really about like profit maximization, you know, growth, never-ending growth, and some other really harmful logics. And I think that like to balance those out, like we need more worker power in the workplace, because then that really centers the worker in this equation and not just the profits of the organization. You know, I think that we need more unions in this country. That some of the happiest countries in the world have the highest union percentage rate. And that's because the workers are fighting for what they want, you know? I think there should be more cooperation in the workplace. You know, Sylvester mentioned earlier that like we are basically getting divided and conquered, and we're fighting for crumbs. But part of that is also because like we live in a society that values individualism more than community, you know. But having organizations like worker cooperatives are really focused on, and worker-owned cooperatives basically own the business, they own the means of production, and they make decisions on how the business is going to operate cooperatively, you know, and that really helps people be in community with one another, which I think improves health. Because like, I'm about to go off on a rabbit hole really quickly, but one thing that really bugs me sometimes is that we tell people that they just need to like go to therapy. You know, we offer like an individualist solution, and therapy's great. I go to therapy, I love it. But like, as soon as you walk out those doors, you have to interact with community. And it can be really hard to sit here and be healed or be on your healing journey, but it's not be in proximity with other people who are on that journey as well. So I think it's important to be thinking about, how we go through some of these processes with communities so that we're all healing together, and not just doing it in individualist ways. And then on the policy front, like higher wages, I had mentioned earlier that in low wage jobs, people don't even know what their schedule is going to be for the week. A real simple solution for that is to have scheduling ordinances so that managers and employers have to tell their employees a week or 2 weeks in advance what their schedule is going to look like, So those are just like a couple of things that come to mind that I think will help a little bit with, accounting for people's mental health. And then the last thing, and this is, I'm a big fan of W. Du Bois. Like anything he's produced, I've tried to read. He's produced way too much because the man almost lived 100 years, but he's literally one of our greatest Black minds. And one of the things that he wrote in the 1920s was basically a blueprint for an economy that really centered our self-development. And what he basically said is that, like, what we need to progress as a society is an economy that is really centered around the development of our people, and it's really centered around like our well-being and at furthering our education and so on. And that's the type of economy that I personally would like to see. Not one that's only concerned about profit, because I believe that if you are concerned about the self-development of our people, the profit will come, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but it'll be enough to sustain ourselves. So that's the type of economy that I would like to see. One that's really rooted in collaboration, that's really rooted in like community development. And then just the type of economy that allows us to lead self-determined lives that aren't relying on some corporation giving us a job.
Yeah, wow. I know everything that you both have said has definitely inspired me. I know it will inspire our viewers. And with that, our last question for the our formal panel, what is some advice that you would give to people so that they can take ownership and have some autonomy and start that process of breaking free within their own lives and also within their smaller communities?
I think with that, I think there's a blueprint out there for us. And I feel like with a lot of things in life, we can follow those who came before us, and build off of what they started. And I look at the Black Panthers and what they did with the different community programs that they had, Breakfast Club program, mutual aid, they ushered a lot of that in. And the education that they were giving to the kids as well. And the key with that was that if they're trying to tell you about how society is structured, you just have a random person on the street that's just trying to hit you with a newspaper and you don't know nothing about them, you don't know where they come from, you're likely not to listen to that person, right? But then if you have someone that is in the community and they're feeding your kids and they're educating your kids, they're already proving that they can provide some benefit, a net positive to your life. So if you can already prove and show to me that you can provide net positive to my life, whatever else you bring to the table, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and trust that you know what you're talking about because you're already serving, right? So I think that, one way that we can definitely start to take more autonomy within our lives and within our communities is, and then really trying to educate and bring people in to the movement to be more engaged, is to really focus on meeting people where they're at. Because I strongly believe that if you take the time and interest to show that you care about what other people care about, then they're more likely to care about something that you care about. It's a lot harder to lead someone to something without any buy-in. I feel like the way we get people to buy into the things that we're talking about to improve the community is that we have to buy in and invest in them. So the statement, so join your PTAs, join the local PTAs. You don't have to have a kid, within the school to join a PTA. That's just something for the community. That's, and what do people care about more than anything else? The children. It's a great opportunity to, really start to connect with community members. And then, in addition to that, something I always take with me, And I heard Dr. Cornell West say it. I'm sure somebody else said it. But he said, I am who I am because somebody loved me. And that's a statement that, a quote that I keep close to my heart, because it really directs how, my relationships with other people are. It really reminds me that I am the person who I am because the environment shaped around me was love. And so many times people who, end up harming themselves or harming others is because they came up in an environment devoid of love. So, I'll take that onto your heart and share that with other people and meet people where they're at.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give two perspectives on this. For any bosses on the call, you might not like this advice, but I think that, and I'll just clarify as well, is like I typically don't like to offer like individualist solutions, but I think that this one has been helpful for me. Finding places to like resist in the workplace, I think is very powerful. Like if you know that your job isn't paying you what you deserve, then I think that while you're on the clock, you should be taking the time to do things that fill you up. I remember there's this video where there's this little boy like talking to his dad about his job, and the dad was basically like, I ain't getting paid enough. Little boy is like, well, why don't you do bare minimum? And he's like, because I'll get fired. And the boy's like, then that ain't bare minimum, because you ain't gonna get fired for doing the bare minimum. So I just think that like finding places to resist in the workplace and, working on yourself while you're on the clock has actually been a way for me to reclaim my time and my power, And one of the reasons why I say that is there's this book called Race Rebels, and it's by Robin G.D. Kelly. And he basically says that Black people have had a whole history of resisting in the workplace in little ways like that, just to regain a little bit of our power. So I'm a big believer in doing that as well. Hopefully my boss doesn't see this. If he does, I'm doing my job. Secondly, I think that it's important to remember that like we don't break free alone. That's like a narrative that is often told in this economy, that like your liberation is really going to be achieved in you accumulating wealth and dipping out on your community. And, I've been in close proximity with very wealthy men who were miserable because they didn't have nobody side by side with them. So I think that like when we're talking about like breaking free and not living a stressful life in the future, it's really about breaking free with community and fighting with community so that we're all liberated, so we could all celebrate together once we are free. And then, this is related to what Sylvester was saying, but like, trauma and stress, like it really breaks us down and it makes us feel disempowered, to the point where like, we don't care about politics no more. We really don't even care about money. And we start to get into some other vices that are destructive for our lives. But, one of the things that like King and Ella Baker talks about this, which if y'all don't know who Ella Baker is, it's the mother of the civil rights, please look her up. But they all talk about how you are transformed in doing the work. And what that basically means is that like, when you're fighting for liberation, when you're fighting against systems, you actually become transformed and empowered through that, and all that trauma and stress that you experience that tried to break you down, like it don't go away because it's always going to be there, but you become empowered in ways that you're able to work through that. So I definitely think that like getting engaged and fighting for what you deserve is definitely a critical piece of being empowered as we, walk through this life.
Yeah, thank you both for those definite takeaways. I think that'll be really useful for our listeners. And also thank you for the wealth of knowledge that you provide in your perspectives as we've talked about capitalism's effect on society, mental health, and also what that reimagination looks like. At this time, I definitely want to give the opportunity for some question and answers. We have some really well-written questions. I guess we're kind of trying to do a speed round, maybe one person per each, however you all feel. But yeah, so first question, whoever wants to go first.
I can go first. So my name is Cha-Cha, she, her, hers. I'm very much interested. I'm somebody that likes to not only look internally at US policies, but also look at a lens of like comparative policies in politics. So my question is, for the panelists, are you aware of any examples outside of the US where policies exist to protect and improve capitalistic practices? Or do you know of any existing policies in other countries that have been more effective at wealth distribution amongst its citizens?
I'll let Eric go because you touched on the international level.
Yeah, so here's a couple things that come to mind. One, like a lot of people like to point out some of like the social democracy that exists, in Denmark and Sweden and those types of places. And I think that what they do is they do a good job of balancing like worker power against some of the corporate power that exists, and they have like mixed economies where like worker cooperatives and organizations with high union rates are able to balance out and, fight against some of the corporatism that exists there. So I think that those are examples of, where wealth is distributed more equitably, not necessarily to the level that I would like, but those are just a couple examples that come to mind. And then the other thing that I would just say is, and this isn't internationally, but it could almost feel like it because of the type of exclusion that was happening. But sometimes I like to remind people that, like, in the early 20th century in America, like when Black people didn't have access to capitalism, we built our own economies that were built off of collaborative practices and where the resources were distributed more equitably, because that's the only way people were going to survive. But the only reason why we don't know about those things is because they were often destroyed by white supremacy, and, whether we're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Malcolm X, Du Bois, like I mentioned earlier, all of them believed in a more cooperative way of organizing our economy. So all that to say is that, like, I think the alternatives do exist and have existed, but capitalism wants to sustain its power so much that it's going to ensure that they're destroyed, right? And the reason why I brought that up and wanted to provide a Black perspective first is we see that internationally with some of the socialist countries as well. They got a lot of flaws that need to be worked out, but also part of the reason why they don't continue is because the US will put an embargo on them. The US will, enact a coup in other countries. So sometimes it's hard to find the alternatives because capitalism wants there not to exist any alternatives. So that's just, one thing to highlight, because it can be hard to find the alternatives, but they do exist historically, and there is a world beyond capitalism.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question.
I'm sorry, I talked a lot. I wasn't sure if Sylvester wanted to touch on that. My bad.
No, it's good. It was a speed round question, so we doing one on.
So this question is directed for whoever would like to answer, but I noticed that earlier Eric was mentioning how in these low wage, minimum wage type of jobs, there's often not a lot of time for self-care and leisure time for yourself, going to doctor's appointments, stuff like that. Trust me, I've been there. I worked in a restaurant my entire life. But how do you think we can more efficiently provide access to resources and support those who do work those labor intensive and super time intensive jobs?
I would go to what Eric was talking about, I mean, just, disobedience in the workplace, organizing with your coworkers to take over that space. I know when the last question, we were talking about different models that other countries have that, that could improve quality of life here. There's a city in Spain that is completely filled with worker co-ops. Again, where more control is going to the workers. Something else that I think that we should discuss more too is community land trust that puts communities more in control of the people who actually have to live there, and they can plan out what the needs are for their community. So I think on a micro level of that within the workplace, is it discussing with your with your coworkers, how much do you get paid, in comparison to me, just to make sure everybody has the same wages. If we aren't all getting the same wages, we have to understand that the employees are the reason why these businesses exist in the first place. And that's why, that's my biggest argument, for a living wage for people, is because how can you, meet your needs, right? But I'm the reason why your business is sustainable and I can't meet my needs. So you really control all the power. They came up with the idea, they took the risk, but you're also taking the risk as well. And they also couldn't survive without you. And we have a symbiotic relationship. So, my response to that would be is that you all have the power. Just, talk with your coworkers, put together a fund if you all want to go on a strike, where again, there's a sacrifice of the collective for the betterment of the whole.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Yeah, hi. So there's this idea that there's like trickle down economics, but as both of you mentioned, resources are not always distributed as well as we would like. How do you think we could change the ways resources are distributed to be beneficial for all, or so that they're more evenly allocated?
Yeah, so like just to reinforce the way that like trickle down economics it really doesn't work. After I was just reading that after the George, Floyd's death last year, that corporations donated $95 billion towards, economic justice, racial equity. But 90% of what they donated was really like an investment or a loan that will ensure that they get everything that they donated back and more. So like this idea that like the nice billionaires will save us is just not true. And the only thing that they often really care about is trying to figure out how they can fill their pockets with more wealth, more political power, and so on. But to answer your question, I think that this comes back to like what I was stating earlier. Like, yes, we could tax the rich, which is very difficult to do politically because, often the rich are filling the pockets of the politicians, but like, I think we need to have some serious discourse just around giving people what they deserve in the first place. So you don't have to tax the rich, giving people, the wealth that they are producing through their labor without, allocating most of that to the wealthiest, because I feel like we have gotten content with our like $15 an hour, whatever it is that we're getting paid. But like, if you were really to, I got all these articles coming to my mind right now. I read one article that said that a business wanted to give their workers all of the profits that they made for a day. They wanted to distribute it equitably so that, just as like a bonus. And some of the workers that were getting paid like $50, $60 an hour ended up taking like $700 an hour home that day. So the resources are there, but it's just about like pre-distribution of those and just giving people what they deserve in the first place, rather than having to like redistribute money from the wealthiest people. So that's at least my perspective on it. And I am 100% an advocate of taxing, the wealthiest people in this country at this moment, but I also think there needs to be just some discourse around pre-distribution.
Thank you so much. I think that's definitely an interesting concept. Next question.
Hi. So Sylvester, you mentioned that slavery was rooted within capitalism, which I love because I'm a sociology and gender studies major, so I've definitely read a lot about that. And it basically justifies making people feel less than, which is like the same thing we see today, people being exploited. Do you think that if that mindset was, if the mindset and value of labor and people was fundamentally changed, that it could help with many of the problems that come from a capitalist society? And how would you recommend this fundamental change occur?
So yes to everything you said. The other thing I'll say is that a quote from Dr. King, and he was talking about it in his speech, "Where do we go from here, community or chaos?" But he said that, you're not going to catch me in a bind. I'm not arguing for communism because communism forgets that life is individual. And I'm also not, advocating for capitalism because capitalism forgets that life is social and that we shouldn't be looking for our solution in the thesis of communism or the antithesis of capitalism, but then we should be looking for a higher synthesis and creating something that, that doesn't have a name yet and that combines the truth of both concepts. So I think that, not limiting ourselves to what we've been presented today is a key root in creating that beloved community, beloved society that we're trying to build to. And then on top of that, again, the solution is organizing together, meeting people where they're at, and showing that you can improve the quality of their lives so that they can, take that same investment that you put in them into you, which in turn goes into the movement, which in turn goes to hopefully a general strike, which is what I'm hoping for with everything that's going on right now. Because I think that's how we really shift power in this country.
Yeah, great, thank you. And we have another question.
Hi, this one, I keep messing up the order of who's answering, but this one was just going into a little bit more about Sylvester, how you mentioned that the scarcity mindset makes individuals or certain groups scapegoats a lot of the time, and it is specifically targeted at Black and Brown folks, which creates division within those communities. How do you think we should foster unity rather than divisiveness when capitalism perpetuates that type of competing with each other within your own communities and that type of ideology?
A quick answer to that is, again, it goes back to meeting people where they're at, in the whole sum. But like, for instance, if my issue is climate, right? Like so we have to understand that we can't be caught up in these silos because all these issues are interrelated. So if, say, you're a climate justice advocate, then you need to show up to the immigration marches. And if you're an immigration advocate, then you need to show up to the healthcare marches. And, if you're a healthcare worker, then you need to show up to the teacher strikes. Like, when you show up for other people in their spaces, that's when we start to see how all connected all of our issues are. And that's how you start to build that class solidarity. That's how you start to build that rainbow coalition that, Chairman Fred Hampton was building with the Black Panthers. So it's meeting people where they're at and understanding that your issue isn't the most important issue, but then all the sum of the issues that we're all fighting for together And creating that Voltron type of, character is what's going to get us to, liberation and creating a society that meets everybody needs instead of being siloed off in the way that capitalism wants us divided.
In the spirit of community, Eric, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I completely agree with everything that was said right there. Maybe the one additional thing that I would just say is that, like, I think another real easy way to like build solidarity and community is to like help people make their personal issues political, right? And what I'm basically mean by that, and this is like a very common term, particularly in feminist spaces, but basically like if you hear a person is struggling with something at work, just know that there are 10 other people who are struggling with that same thing. And instead of allowing them to stay in their silo and think that it's just happening to me, build bridges so that they recognize like this is actually happening to all of us. And this is a structural issue that if we come together, doesn't have to be a problem for any of us, So making the personal political, I think, is like another great way of just building solidarity and helping people to come together to fight the issues that are impacting all of them. I finally got a clap from Sylvester, so now I'm feeling good about myself. I'm good, like.
Yes, I love.
I didn't know how to do it until I kept seeing you do. I'm like, how's he doing that? And then I look at the reaction. I'm like, oh, okay, let me show him some love back.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad that you all are supporting each other too. And I think I think you are two great panelists that that have been able to kind of really work with one another to answer all these questions. I think we have one last question. If whoever wants to go and do that one. Okay. Sorry, we're gonna probably put this, but I guess my question is, what groups do you think are most important for collaboration to occur for the betterment of the masses?
Oh, I got it. What groups are most collaborative? What groups are most?
What groups do you think are most important for collaboration? Where do you think we need to build those bridges in our communities? Maybe people that we haven't thought that we need to talk to. Just kind of some ideas, just to give the audience some inspiration as to who they might need to reach out to.
Yeah, so I'm not normally I don't advocate for pocket watching, but I think that again we got to really build class solidarity, and that's even the way that I look at a lot of celebrities or athletes that I looked at before, where again you might think that they're for the cause, and then you see how they move politically, and a lot of how they move politically is shaped by the class that they're in. I'll give you an example. Someone that when I was a youth, I'm 27 now, when I was a youth coming up, someone I looked up to was Obama, right? And Obama made me feel safe, he was a brother in office, and, I wanted to aspire to be like that. The older I got, the older I got, and how much I saw that his politic didn't really, wasn't race aligned, it was his class. And that was corporatist, that was Wall Street, that was the prison industrial complex, all of those things that doesn't resonate with my background. And even though we, may have, similar skin tones, his class politic was different from my class politic because we come from, different classes. We're supported by different classes. So I think that any movement that there's that we're in the same, it's around the same tax bracket, I think is a space that you need to be in. But I mean, if you want to give, there's a whole bunch of organizations. I just look at the different sectors. I mean, nurses, teachers, people that work, trade, people that work in trade with their hands. Again, working class people, poor people, people who aren't employed, who need a reason to be involved. A lot of the tenets of what the Poor People's Campaign was about. Those are the groups and the people that you should be around, and you know that if you're around those people, that there's a chance for revolutionary change with those people, because your politic is going to be aligned.
Yeah, thank you. Eric, do you have any ideas or suggestions as well?
Yeah, no, I second all that again. I feel like that's probably the most common phrase for me tonight. But yeah, I think that it's important to be tracking the different movements that labor is involved in. And then the one thing that I would just mention is that, like, there are organizations that are centered around like charismatic leadership, and around individuals. And for me, those are just the organizations to like watch out for, because we're human, we're flawed. And to have an organization centered around one person I think is very dangerous. But thankfully, because of like the work of Black feminists, they're like really challenging our notions of leadership and have more group-centered leadership organizations that are like more democratic, non-hierarchical, and are organizing around like what I like to call the Black radical tradition. So just some organizations that come to mind that are like that are like Dream Defenders, Movement for Black Lives. One organization that I help organize with on the side is Black Men Build. And, they're really about like a more distributed leadership approach, and they really value like local organization. That's the other thing, is like, it's good to follow what's happening nationally. It's good to follow what's happening internationally, but like the place where we have the most impact is locally. So figure out what organizations are doing good work locally, still track all those things that I just mentioned, but get involved with what's happening on the ground in your communities, because that's where you'll have potentially the most impact.
Thank you so much. Definitely have some calls to action there. And I would just like to thank you again both for joining us for this Leaders Link Up on Reimagining Capitalism in America. The Yellow Heart Committee, we are a nonprofit organization that's mobilizing to support the holistic mental health of trauma survivors through policy advocacy, education, and community outreach. We do all of this through our pillars of heart, which are healing, empowerment, advocacy, relationships, and therapy. And our vision is that we're aiming to create a world where the barriers between people and policy are broken, and survivors of trauma have access to spaces for holistic healing and comprehensive education. So I hope that we hit our vision and mission tonight. And thank you all so much for joining us.
I'm Christiana Welsh. I am a Community Outreach Associate at the Yellow Heart Committee, and today I'm here with Tamara Strohauer to have a discussion on capitalism's effect on society, mental health, and what a trauma-informed reimagination could look like. Tamara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Christiana. It's great to be here with you. I'm Tamara Strohauer, and I have a few different roles. I teach social work at San Diego State. I had the honor of having Christiana in 2 of my classes so far in her process. So I teach Introduction to Social Work and Introduction to Social Welfare. And I'm also the Serve Indigenous Social Workers for Change project coordinator for Southern California. So kind of the short story of that is that I work with all the schools of social work in California, and specifically the 10 schools in the southern region, from Cal State Northridge to Cal State San Bernardino down to San Diego State, where I am based. And as Serve project coordinator, I work with our Indigenous communities very closely. I work with communities in setting up internships, in bringing Native students into Bachelor and Master of Social Work programs. And a big part, and part of my favorite part of this role is working toward decolonizing social work curriculum. So I get to do trainings with the Master of Social Work students at different universities on California Indian history, historical trauma, ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. So for me, it's very important that all social work students are learning the history of the people whose land we're on, how manifest destiny and capitalism removed or attempted to remove Native culture and ways and practices that existed for thousands of years. And let's see, I'm also part of the Southern California Warrior Spirit Coalition. So in 2018, we held a trauma conference, a national trauma conference at Viejas Reservation, the resort. And this was calling upon the warrior spirit to heal historical trauma conference and ceremony. And the purpose of that event was to bring together the neuroscience of trauma and what we know through ACEs science with indigenous wisdom and traditional healing practices. So this was a 3-day event where we alternated between practitioners and scholars and community members sharing their own stories and their family and their ancestor stories of trauma and resilience. So I'm very honored and humbled always to be here on Kumeyaay land, to have a relationship with the people who have cared for this land since the beginning of time. And I'm very excited to participate with you all today.
Yes, and we're excited to hear what you have to say. So thank you for being with us. So let's just jump right into capitalism's effects on society. So the first question would be, what was the moment that you realized the impacts of capitalism in not only your life, but in the lives of others around you?
Well, I don't know when I realized the term capitalism exactly, but I grew up with a single mom in a small town in Colorado, and she worked 2 jobs waiting tables. I was very cognizant of the way that other kids lived in difference to us. I was very aware of the stigma and shame that came with receiving public services. My mom would drive to the next town to use her food stamps because she was embarrassed to be seen with that. I was very aware that there wasn't equity in how people lived or what was possible. When I graduated from high school, I went straight to work because that was the way it was. And getting a college education wasn't even on the radar for me. And I probably learned more on an internal and a physical level of understanding once I actually went to college. So I started at San Diego City College at 44 years old as a first generation college student. And I started to learn terms like white privilege. I started to think about our bigger society and the way that we live. I had actually been painting houses with my husband for 15 years. So I worked for people who had a lot of privilege. I worked for people who were benefiting from the capitalist society. And that wasn't my family's story. Yeah, I think that answered that question.
Yes, thank you. And it's an amazing answer of how you realize capitalism affected your life and those around you. So what is an argument for some arguments for capitalism say that it aids in the creation of jobs, stimulates the economy, improves the quality of life for the average American household. However, some others argue that capitalism does not benefit everyone. Capitalism's dependency on social hierarchies, coupled with its unpredictable cycles of growth and retraction, raises anxiety, sometimes to the level of traumatic stress. Do you think that capitalism today is more of a net positive or net negative as far as its impacts on society?
Wow, that's a big one to unpack, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, the assumption that anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that everyone can be anything they want, they just have to apply themselves, that America is the land of opportunity and you just have to want it and you can do anything, is an opinion that's vastly handed down by people who have money, who have a way of navigating this. And when, I love, the saying, but if you don't have boots, right? And I often hear people will say, well, why don't, especially working with Indigenous communities, why don't they just leave the reservation and go get jobs? And the misunderstanding of home, of place, of relationship, of culture, that things are not equitable across society. So this nation became a nation under the idea of manifest destiny, that God himself had told the white settlers to take this land in the name of basically capitalism, in the name of industry, in the name of creating, and the native people who had cared for this land forever were not considered even human. So how much even today is there equity in how human people are considered to be when we talk about capitalism, and that everyone can have this, and make America great again means, for who has opportunity. When we're talking about, Indigenous people, when we're talking about immigrants, when we're talking about refugees, when we're talking about BIPOC, there is not equity in opportunity. And it takes money to make money in a capitalist society, to be able, there are those amazing ideas that someone may have, and may be able to have this incredible entrepreneurial spirit and create something from a thought. But that's always going to require backing. It's going to require networking. It's going to require relationships that may not be attainable for many people. And the way that our hierarchy of society, that kind of top down, bottom up, the way that even public schools were set up, that we needed a labor force. This country was created on the backs of a labor force, beginning with slavery, beginning with bringing people here who would do the work for the elite who started this country, beginning with genocide and killing millions of people for their land that held the oil, that held the gold, that held the resources that were needed to build this capitalist society. It was created through murder, through slavery, and through a decision that only certain children would learn certain things in school, and the rest would be kept at a different level to make sure there was a labor force. That continues today. The inequity in public schools by area, by the monetary, by the taxes in the school area, by who is in the school, what's available even as an education, to even be uplifted to learn in a creative way, still exists. The suspension and expulsion rates of Native, Black, and Mexican, and different people is not the same. So we continue as a society to keep people in a level of oppression collectively as people. And then there is an assumption and a big raising of fists and raising of arms that, anybody can be anything great. Anyone can do this. And it's just not the experience that is true for too many of our citizens. Citizens who weren't even allowed to vote for a very long time. When in our Constitution, when we said, and when we talk about the pursuit of happiness, and that all men are created equal, all men were not created equal in that document. That meant white landowners. That was who that was talking about. And so, is it still that to a certain degree when we talk about who capitalism benefits? For sure, it's important to have the freedom to create a business, to create something out of potentially an idea, and to grow with that and to serve people. But we're just not there yet in equity and understanding of how this continues to impact the same people on whose backs capitalism was built.
Yes, definitely. If only it could be fixed so simply, which is definitely not a simple solution. There are many factors. So now for capitalism's effect on mental health. According to PACES, countries with the highest levels of economic inequality have the greatest number of people with stress-related diseases. What are your thoughts on the effects of economic disparities created by capitalism leading to social hierarchies and their relationship to stress?
So it's tremendous. It's tremendous, that pressure to be able to go out and do what you need to do to take care of your family. Social media has such a huge impact on kids, even to be seeing constantly the haves, who has what they have, and to want things and to need things, and the pressure on parents to be able to provide things when even just keeping a roof over our heads can be a tremendous struggle. And that toll that it takes, that toxic stress of constantly being in that amygdala. So you mentioned PACES. So when we talk about really the neuroscience of trauma and of stress, it's tremendous, the impact of that constant hypervigilance, of having to push forward, of trying to navigate systems that may not, that certainly weren't built for all people and may be nearly impossible to navigate for some. The need, even for myself working at a university and all the different roles that I have, I wake up, in the middle of the night, sometimes just like, oh, I got to do this and I got to do that. And we have this constant push to create, to go, to move, to do things all the time. And, that was honestly when the pandemic first hit. And you were in my class when that happened, Christiana. And I really felt like there was something mystical about it in the beginning, that the human race had just been put on timeout, almost that Mother Earth had sent us all to our rooms. And we talked about that a lot in our class. And it was seeing the animals come back out, seeing nature come back to life, and seeing what was possible if human beings just slowed down and just let the earth alone for a minute, was pretty magical for me. It was very spiritual for me, and hoping that we would all come back into the world in a good way, in a gentler way, that we would take better care of each other and the earth and ourselves, and that we would all benefit from slowing down. But that's really not how we're coming back into the world. We took a trip up to Santa Cruz, and both sides of the freeway all through LA was just bumper to bumper again. All the cars are back, all the people are back. And I'm probably going on a bit of a tangent here from what your question was. Can you actually pause it for just a minute? Wait, nope.
Continue.
Okay, so actually PACES is something that is very important to me in a lot of the work I do. So that was a big part of what we were doing with the warrior spirit. So knowing the economic disparities from childhood on up that were created by capitalism do bring on, chronic stress for parents. Even in children, toxic stress can be expressed in children. What we know about the neuroscience and brain development of living in poverty is extreme. So a parent going through stress is less able to care for their child, to less able to be present for their child, maybe working 2 or 3 jobs. Homelessness is huge. There are children growing up on the streets. What we know about the long-term effects of chronic stress in childhood is that it impacts brain development. It impacts that prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that is that executive functioning, that holds empathy, that understands consequences, that processes time. And when you're growing up with intergenerational poverty and just trying to get to those basic needs, you know, those Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just the basic needs of food, shelter, what is, you know, healthcare, the things that are basic that most people take for granted, if those are not available, and how that impacts families across generations, that intergenerational trauma brought on just by poverty, let alone the societal impact of how people are treated, what it's like for a child to go to school hungry, how they're able to learn, how they're able to be in their bodies. I know during this pandemic, there was such an impact of people losing their jobs, of, you know, the ongoing things that happen in families when there is that stress. So for sure, the social hierarchies, it is very different to be locked down in a very nice home that has heat, that has running water, that has food in the refrigerator, the ability to have food delivered to your home, because on an app on your smartphone, very different for families living in poverty during that time, families living in rural areas where there was no Wi-Fi access to be in school. What we know for sure is that domestic violence increases, substance use increases when people are in that chronic stress and not able to meet their basic needs. And watching and seeing the way other people are living while you are just trying to feed your child. And it is much easier to feed a family of 4 off the dollar menu of McDonald's than to buy healthy food. And all of these things impact on a cellular level the growth of a child who will become that next generation. So
Yes.
it's profound, the impact that stress based on social hierarchies created by capitalism and what's available.
Yeah, thank you for that valuable insight, especially how it refers to our recent year in pandemic. And the next question is the use of the phrase "all Americans are able." So I know you touched on this before, you know, with like, you can do it as long as you dream it, like anyone can be successful. This is a common value ingrained within capitalism, which renders all Americans equivalent, regardless of the inherent disparities across race, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic level, making it potentially exceedingly difficult to succeed if you belong to a marginalized group. How do you think the process of capitalism may have specifically contributed to the trauma of these marginalized groups, BIPOC, women, queer people, etc.?
So yeah, I definitely think that one of the earlier questions brought all this up for me, because honestly, this question is so much of who I am and what I teach and what I feel is the most important issue when we talk about social justice, you know, of that non-understanding, mis-teaching of history, the lack of our textbooks from childhood on up of telling the true history of this nation and how we got here is everything to me. So, you know, the trauma, when we talk about historical trauma, so the term historical trauma was coined when they started finding PTSD symptoms in the offspring of survivors of the Jewish Holocaust who had not actually experienced that trauma firsthand. And so we started, looking at, when you look at people and communities of people who have historically, generation after generation after generation, been beaten down, been murdered, been held as non-human, had basic rights and needs taken, enslavement, concentration camps, Indian reservations are prisoner of war camps. That is how they were created. And so when, we have this assumption, for since the beginning of a society, queer LGBT plus people were murdered. We had eugenics in this nation back in the 1920s. There was eugenics of deciding who gets to breed, sterilization of deaf people, of people with developmental disabilities, sterilization of indigenous people through the boarding schools. We are still sterilizing people to prevent, people from having families, big families, and that encouragement. So that assumption, that global, or that, model of the all-American family, that nuclear family, a husband and a wife and 2.5 children, and that white picket fence and that house, that whole image that was the building of this nation, especially after, World War II and coming into the 50s and 60s, before the civil rights era, people just didn't appear to exist except maybe in entertainment. And those amazing entertainers like Billie Holiday were not allowed to even eat dinner in the places where they performed. So the way that the level of humanity of entire groups of people, the inhumanity of the treatment of entire groups of people, even up until this day, is extreme. We've lived in a very polarized society for the last 5 years of, unemployment's the lowest it's ever been. Well, being employed doesn't mean you're having a sustainable life. If that employment puts you just over the limit of receiving the services that you need, of receiving TANF support, of having health insurance, of having, food on the table, you might be just over what is considered the federal poverty line. And all too often, it is people of color, it is people from marginalized communities who are just barely able to survive. And, the services that are provided and that hand up, right? That hand down, hand up, that gap between in the humanness that is so important to be thriving and functioning and growing and becoming just isn't there. And it is on the trail of that concept of manifest destiny. In fact, there was a speech by our former president where he actually was claiming manifest destiny over space, over Mars, that this country will colonize space the way we did this great nation, and manifest destiny was genocide in the name of one true God. So even the way that we collectively, through capitalism and through the people who have the power and the money to lobby for laws and policies that continue to impact underserved populations, the disparities are vast.
Yeah, and these structures that are created by capitalism definitely contribute to a lot of trauma for marginalized groups especially. So now for the reimagination portion, how do you think that shifting priorities from an economy that prioritizes productivity and gross domestic product based on productivity to an economy that prioritizes mental health would look?
Wow. Again, that's a lot to unpack. So we've been talking about trauma. We've been talking about the impact of trauma when we talk about PACEs, when we talk about, what the adverse childhood experiences study showed was that as the number of childhood traumas go up, and that includes economic disparities, that includes, basic care, basic functioning of human beings from the time they are born and going on. What we know is that the health outcomes and the cost in public health. So when we're talking about mental health, public health, and the cost of trauma, and that those disparities in the trauma brought by capitalism and the assumption that people should be able to take better care of themselves, if we were prioritizing mental health, if we were prioritizing healing trauma, when we talk about epigenetics and have an understanding of when I think about epigenetics, thinking about the fact that I was born with all the eggs that I would ever have, which means my children were there in my mother's womb. So if today we have a child who is experiencing trauma, if we have a parent who is living in poverty, experiencing mental health issues because of their situation and not able to thrive on just basic functioning levels within that mother, within that child, are the next generations of their family. And if we could conceptualize the cost in, if you want to talk dollars and cents, if we want to talk capitalism, the costs of the health disparities and the health issues that are created by trauma that is actually brought on by the hierarchy of our systems, and we were prioritizing well-being and mental health and putting a fraction of the dollars that are spent on repairing the health problems that are happening with people who have not had their mental health needs met. The emergency room visits, that is a tremendous. I know a lot of people have done the data and studies and comparing that dollars and cents, and so there's dollars and cents, and then there's dollars and cents, right? And there's our heart and our minds, and understanding how we have treated also persons with mental illness historically as a nation, from the asylums to sterilization, to all the things that have been done, rather than treating and uplifting and providing opportunities for people to heal and to care for their families. We would have a vast difference in even what the cost ratio is. So, what we know is so many dollars go into, those health issues that are brought on by not providing basic care and prevention at the forefront. So being able to be with people and help people through what they need. Most of the people that we see who are homeless are struggling with mental health issues, whether or not, and it's kind of like we're always looking at that kind of chicken and the egg analogy. Did the mental health issues lead to, that experiencing houselessness, or did houselessness lead to the mental health issues, or was it all combined? And when we don't care for people's basic needs, when we don't consider what's needed, and when we look at the substance abuse issues, the fentanyl overdose issues that we're experiencing on such a tremendous level, what we know for sure is that pain medication, that our brains don't distinguish between emotional and physical pain. And these drugs relieve both. So it is very, very reinforcing to have a moment of relief from that emotional pain. Those physical symptoms, our body, our heart, our mind, all tied together all the time on a cellular level. If people's basic care and feeling empowered and feeling supported by caring for mental health, we would have a vastly different world. And knowing that the very systems that are creating and exasperating mental health issues are profiting on so many levels also on that mental health issues is something that I think, there are a lot of people really working to unpack that. And it's where we must go. We as a society are not sustainable just based on greed and capitalism and, the who has and who has not.
Yeah, That's definitely very true. And starting at the forefront of all these issues is very important for mental health. So what policy or societal changes do you think this country needs to implement to make sure that moving away from capitalism would be trauma informed, in the sense that mental health is accounted for in the average American work week?
I just love this. So, first of all, when we're talking about being trauma informed, it's really about looking at what happened to someone, not what's wrong with someone. And that's not just individual. What happened to groups of people? What happened to Native American tribes? What's happening now to refugees? What's happening to children who are being removed from their families at the border? What happened in communities, and understanding that we're always moving forwards and backwards between our history, our present, and our future. And that, it's really a hoop. So Indigenous people never thought of time, they thought of place, and life and passing was like a hoop. So when we're talking about being trauma informed and we're looking at what happened to people and communities as opposed to what's wrong, it's really critical, I think, to also be looking at what's strong with people. So all of our assessments are very deficit based, and we're going to have policies that start looking at, pause it for a second.
So for the final question, if we live in a capitalist society that triggers traumatic stress, how do we break free?
Good question. So I would say the most important thing we can do is self-care, of learning to prioritize time for ourselves, for our families, of being willing to say no to things, of being willing to just take breaks, to time out, to prioritize that quiet time. We are going all the time. And even we don't leave our work anymore because we all have these phones with emails on there. We're all expected to respond and reply and to be engaged 24/7 in this capitalized society that we're in. And if you're not there, someone else will be there. And that constant push and feeling like I need to be, I should, I could, I would. And I think the most important way that we can break free starts in here. And it starts with being able to really see each other, to be able to listen to each other. Too often, even when we're in conversations with our loved ones, with our families, we're not really hearing them. We're not really seeing each other. We don't take the time to just be. And even in a conversation, as we're speaking, we're thinking of the next thing, or we're waiting for that person to stop talking because we know we have to get to the next thing, or we're on our phones and we're looking at the person, but we're really here. So that toxic stress of that constant going, that hypervigilance, and even especially in the next generation coming up, your generation, Christiana, you've almost never lived in a time when there wasn't input from so many places constantly that we don't even know how to just be. So I think that heart-centered love, that finding a way to understand what love means, of having love for ourselves, for humanity, for Mother Earth, for the plants, for the animals, of recognizing that we are all in an ecosystem that is finite, and that the bodies we walk around this earth in are finite, and recognizing that those moments lost, you always see these sayings, nobody writes on their headstone, I wish I'd spent more time at the office, right? Or I wish I'd spent more time doing this. And we just collectively, I had touched on before the beginning of the pandemic and what it felt like when the earth slowed down. I've had I had baby hawks in my backyard this spring. There were tons of hawks in San Diego and places where we don't usually see them. And that's because the people were away for a while and animals got to repopulate their natural spaces. There were always their natural spaces. So traumatic stress that we're all experiencing collectively as a human condition because of all of the industry, the technology is moving everything faster and faster and faster, and we can't keep up. And we are chasing something that is just always just beyond our grasp. And it's those moments when we can get quiet, when we can really hear. I don't know if you can hear the birds. So we were hearing a lawnmower, part of technology, right? And now I hear the birds. Those birds don't care what we're doing. They're doing what birds do. And if we can take a moment to be with that and hear that and feel that, to watch, you look at a child, they see everything, and we're rushing them, taking them by the hand. And I'll leave you with one anecdotal story. It's when my youngest daughter was almost 3. I was picking her up from daycare, and I'd had a stressful day, and I had to get home, and I'm trying to get her in the car, into the car seat to get to the next thing. And she's standing there looking at the ground, and I'm trying to rush her into the car. And she said, "Mommy, why does the sidewalk think I'm taller?" And she was looking at her shadow, which was long because of the position of the sun. And I thought, wow, this child is literally contemplating physics and the universe while I'm trying to get her into a car seat. And I just sat with her and I saw the world through her eyes for a little bit. And I think if we can do that, if we can begin to see the way, that discovery way that children discover their world, the way they look at grass, the way they look at bugs, the way they look at animals, if we could start to see our world through those new eyes, if we could start to have love and respect for ourselves as beings, and I like to say that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, not the other way around. And I think that's the slightest possibility of how we can break free, is just giving ourselves moments to be, and to be still, and to be with the people that we love, and stop shitting all over ourselves, stop expecting ourselves to be here or there, everywhere, all at the same time, because that's the world that we live in. We might have a chance. And if we can understand that this earth that we live in doesn't have ultimate resources, and that we've taken most of them and continue to take them, and that we have this one place where we get to spend the next generations, and what are we leaving behind, and what are we bringing to the earth that we live in, that we might be able to alleviate some of that traumatic stress that we are all experiencing on some level every day. And that is certainly not equal across socio and economic lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us here today, and for your perspective. It was very insightful. And thank you for that thorough response.